Stalin is regarded by many as the bloodiest dictator of the 20th century. During his 30-year rule of the Soviet Union, 20 million people were murdered and slaughtered. He personally signed the death warrant for tens of thousands of victims. Yet he created an image of himself so powerful that at the height of his reign he was hailed throughout Russia and the West as the father and savior of the Soviet people. He was admired as the architect of modern industrial Russia. He was seen as the living embodiment of manly strength and virtue. He was worshipped as a national hero, the man of steel.
Stalin regarded himself as the Bolshevik Messiah. He was a messianic egotist. He created an image of himself which he tried to live by. He was the ultimate self-creation.
Stalin's victims lie silent in the Russian soil. As many as 20 million lives were cut short by a brutal regime. But the people who Joseph Stalin oppressed for a quarter of a century mourned his death. His image was that of the father figure.
Yes, for me that was a day almost of despair. I thought, now things are going to get worse.
As Stalin lay in state, his people shed tears for the tyrant who affected the lives of every family in the Soviet Union.
So many close relatives. I lost many of them because of him. I don't know why. There's something I can't explain to this day. But I cried too. Yes, I wept.
That wasn't the real Stalin that I and others like me, were mourning in those days. That was the Stalin myth, the Stalin fantasy.
The real Stalin worked behind the walls of the Kremlin, choosing who would live and who would die. Hundreds of death lists signed in red ink by Stalin himself. Sometimes he crossed out a single name, saving that single person from extinction. But the myth was strong. At its heart was an image of Stalin the father, both to his nation and its children.
Stalin liked to be seen in public as a friendly, fatherly figure, so he would often be seen with young children, young girls, and so on. And this was a deliberate image, which imitated in some respects the image that the Tsar had projected before 1917.
This photograph started it all. Stalin posed with Angelina Markizova, the daughter of a party functionary from Siberia.
Stalin was known as the best friend of artists, writers and what have you, and that was well propagated. But Stalin as the best friend of children, that wasn't such a familiar image. And now there was an illustration to prove that Stalin loved children. And this portrait could be seen absolutely everywhere, really everywhere you went. And a while later, a sculptor called Lavrov came to my hometown. He made a sculpture, a girl on Stalin's arm, and he called it, "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood." Wonderful.
But behind this picture lay the other face of Stalin, which Angelina discovered one day when she came home from school.
My mother greeted me and said, "Papa has been arrested, but don't worry, he's not an enemy of the people. They'll soon release him." But he didn't come back.
Angelina's father was accused of being a Japanese spy. and was executed by firing squad.
So that's how my happy life, my happy childhood came to an end.
At the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow in 1949, the cult of Stalin the father reached its extraordinary climax. It was his 70th birthday.
Stalin took to the stage first. Honestly, believe me, the auditorium was raging. There was hysterical screaming everywhere. Everyone was overcome, jubilant. There were choruses, Father dearest, like that.
This event had been in preparation for months. Every part of the country sent delegates and competed to send gifts for their beloved leader to celebrate his birthday.
We performed at the celebrations in the Bolshoi Theatre. That went as usual. The pioneers came on stage and sang songs and recited poems we'd rehearsed many times. This was precisely the time when Stalin was adulated, worshipped like a god. And that's precisely what was instilled into the children, too. And my childhood began with this idea and ended with this idea.
This extravagant adoration didn't come about by accident. A harsh and strictly religious childhood had sown the seeds of transformation from man to myth. Joseph Stalin was born in a poor family in Georgia, in the southern Caucasus. His real name was Iosif Drugashvili. From the very beginning, Stalin rewrote his own history. His birth certificate reveals his true birthday was the 6th of December 1878, not 1879, as he was to later claim.
Stalin almost believed that mystery was necessary for the great man. That was part of it. Part of it was that he wanted to conceal a lot about his inglorious early years, and so he wanted to invent the glorious Stalin, the man he should have been, the man of steel. He didn't want people to know very much about him, the man.
His parents' home in Gori was to become a place of pilgrimage during Stalin's lifetime. But what the pilgrims were never meant to find out was that this shrine covered a cruel and abusive family home. Stalin's father, a cobbler, was a heavy drinker who regularly beat his son. His strict and devout mother sent him to a religious school. His home life left its mark on the young Joseph. His defiant expression is reminiscent of the young Hitler. Both boys have the same self-confident, almost insolent stare. Stalin, the father figure, couldn't have his image ruined by suggestions of an unhappy childhood, so he set about creating a happy childhood with a loving mother. In case this documentary about his mother revealed any embarrassing truths, Stalin stopped it from being completed. The Soviet people weren't told that Stalin only saw his mother 3 times in 40 years.
I must say that Stalin's relationship with his mother was very poor. Sometimes he even called her an old whore in front of others or his colleagues.
These exclusive pictures show Stalin's mother's funeral in 1937. Unwilling even at her death to face the woman who really knew him, he didn't go to the funeral, just sent a wreath to say goodbye.
She was no peasant woman. At the height of his power, she said to him, "It's a pity you didn't become a priest." I'm sure that's what she said to him. It was very astute and clever.
At the age of 14, Stalin won a scholarship to the seminary at Tiflis. It was here that he met other budding young intellectuals and was introduced to the work of Karl Marx, he found his new religion.
And he also quickly realized something else, that the religion he had cast off, spurned, had to be replaced by something else, especially with the Russian people. The Russian people understood the faith, the Tsar, and the fatherland.
The Russian Orthodox faith relied on the potency of its icons. Images full of the yearning for salvation and happiness hung in every Russian home. When Stalin came to power, he made sure he destroyed the power of the church and replaced its icons with a new image of salvation, Stalin himself.
So there was an exchanging of icons. That was inevitable. The whole system of power rested on it, as well as a certain faith.
For Stalin and the Bolsheviks, there was no room for the old faiths. After he left the seminary, Stalin got the only ordinary job he ever had at the observatory in Tiflis. For the next 2 years, these records show that he worked here as a meteorologist. But in these dying years of the 19th century, Stalin caught the revolutionary fever. On the face of it, it was life as usual for the Tsar and his court, but his family's 300-year reign was on the brink of extinction. Stalin found his feet in the revolutionary movement in Tiflis. As one of the instigators of this May Day demonstration, he was arrested. Police records show that at that point, he changed his name, and Stalin was born. Punishment for agitators was exile. Over the next 20 years, he was to be banished 6 times.
Then he plunged into the underworld, always on the run, in and out of prisons, in and out of exiles. It was an adventurous life, a fascinating life of shadows and mirrors, mystery. It suited Stalin down to the ground.
During one of his periods of exile in Vissarionovich, at the northernmost point of Russia, Stalin met and lived with this woman, Maria Kuzakova. This film was taken 25 years later. Here, Stalin pursued his revolutionary interests, writing and talking with his comrades. He also found time to father a son with Maria. He kept this liaison secret throughout his years in power.
My father told me that Nadia, Stalin's wife, often used to visit him and talk to him. And one time she said, "I know that Joseph Vissarionovich had a son, and I know that son is you."
Stalin's illegitimate son went on to have a high-powered career within the Communist Party, even though Stalin never publicly acknowledged him.
Когда мы с женой очень давно были в Сольвычегодске, очень давно,
When we traveled to Solvitchgorsk a few years ago and went to the house where my father grew up, I was shown the cradle in which Stalin had rocked him.
Soon Stalin left his new baby son behind, slipped past security and escaped for the 6th time from exile. His destination was to join Lenin, already the leading figure of the Russian Revolution. Later, this propaganda movie of the October Revolution would show Stalin as Lenin's right-hand man and confidant. But in reality, not one single picture can be found of Stalin with Lenin during the crucial days leading to the storming of the Winter Palace.
Stalin promoted himself when he was in power as Lenin's right hand. This is hugely exaggerated, but Lenin needed the wonderful Georgian, as he called Stalin, and he needed someone who could get things done, apply pressure, This was Stalin's talent. He won Lenin's respect at that time, even if he was never quite the hero in the front rank that he pretended later.
It was claimed in later propaganda films that Stalin plotted the October uprising alongside Lenin, two close revolutionary heroes. The truth was very different.
Stalin invented the image of himself as second only to Lenin. That's nonsense. But he was one of the top secret agents, secret fixers that Lenin had working for him. The point about Stalin at this period was he was not Trotsky. Trotsky, tough, important and celebrated politician, was the sort of second man. And once Stalin came to power, he began to create himself and promote himself in that position as number two. That was a big myth.
Stalin was not at the Winter Palace the night the Bolsheviks seized power, but because of his secret and shadowy role in the revolution, he needed to pretend he was in the thick of the action to prove how important he had been.
Stalin needed to promote himself as prominent, and hence you see endless films and paintings of Stalin standing next to a towering Lenin right at the front of the platform. That was myth.
In real life, the very first time Stalin was seen on film alongside Lenin was at Lenin's funeral in 1924. And far from being his closest ally, Lenin had already begun to distance himself from Stalin. At this time, Stalin was barely one of the inner circle, but he was seen as useful, someone to do the dirty work.
No one took any notice of Stalin, and that's why no one heeded Lenin's will, which clearly stated that Stalin should be ousted from the post of General Secretary and given a different post.
Lenin's political heirs ignored his will. In their jostle for power, Stalin emerged as the General Secretary of the party, something many of them would later live to regret.
Just imagine, it's perfectly true that Stalin wasn't really anyone special, that everyone else in Lenin's entourage was much cleverer and more talented than Stalin. That was what saved him. Nobody had expected him to turn out to be a great political figure.
As yet, Stalin was just one amongst many potential leaders of the country. But the 45-year-old Stalin wasn't quite ready for his grand entrance.
When Stalin came to power, he couldn't move or express himself eloquently, so he kept a low profile.
These shots of Stalin on the right in the farmer's cap show that he's at the edge of the group, an outsider. He needed to learn how to be a leader.
The actor Kudryavtsev taught him to speak in public. He told him he should speak slowly in measured tones with conviction. He taught him what the speech of a leader should be like, what rules he had to observe. That, incidentally, was quite the opposite to Hitler. Hitler shouted. Hitler excelled through his temperament.
Stalin knew he couldn't compete with Hitler when it came to addressing the crowds, but he developed his own style.
He was a shy and a quiet man, and yet in the long run, he developed a speaking style which was actually remarkably effective. A lot of humor, a certain amount of vulgarity, a good deal of sarcasm. He became actually a very good public speaker. He would have applause all the way through, not just because people were being sycophantic, but because he somehow managed to get his finger on the pulse of what it was that the crowd in front of him wanted. And this was a real skill which he developed and continued right the way through the 1930s.
Stalin was quick to market himself throughout the vast empire of the Soviet Union. His speeches were recorded on gramophone records. and shipped out across the country as presents to worthy comrades. Stalin was already aware of the power of the media. This was just the beginning of the cult of Stalin. The man and the myth were soon to become completely detached from each other, and no one would come to know this better than the women he married. Stalin married his first wife, his childhood sweetheart Kiki Svanidze, during his years on the road working for the revolution. But she died of tuberculosis in 1907, leaving Stalin, he claimed, with a permanently broken heart. 10 years later, Stalin married again. Nadezhda, or Nadia, was an ardent communist who, to begin with, worked alongside him in the Kremlin. All the Bolshevik leadership lived here, their lives closely entwined but hidden from public view. With his second wife, Stalin had 2 children, Vasily and Svetlana. Stalin and Nadia's marriage was a love match, but it could be extremely explosive, and it was not all one-sided.
The key thing about Nadia was that she was a child of Bolshevik family. So the image of her as this sort of angel, this pure angel corrupted by Stalin and his viciousness is just nonsense. She was a Bolshevik through and through.
This is one of only 2 photographs ever taken of the couple together in their 15 years of marriage.
The picture with the Rolls-Royce. Take a good look. Stalin is sitting in the front next to the chauffeur, and in the back sits a very lonely, hunched-up young woman. See? That sums up her situation precisely. She's miles away from him, and she's very lonely.
Nadia wanted a career of her own and to make a contribution to Soviet society away from the hotbed of the Kremlin. In 1929, at the age of 30, she studied engineering at the Industria Academy.
We know now from documents that she often informed on people who were anti-Stalin in the Industrial Academy, to Stalin, to the secret police. So again, you know, not this pure seraph that we've led to believe, but she did obviously pick up outside knowledge, outside the Kremlin hothouse. But in fact, all of them knew that millions of peasants were starving at this time in the countryside. All the leadership knew. It was common knowledge. Most of them believed it was necessary for the revolution. But obviously, Nadia began to worry, like other Bolsheviks, that this was going too far.
These were unwanted criticisms from Stalin's own wife. One witness remembers her saying to Stalin,
"You have tortured them all. You have tortured me. You have tortured the people."
November 1932, and it was the 15th anniversary of the revolution. While Moscow celebrated, the famine and hardship in the countryside reached its height. At a boisterous party that evening, a furious row blew up between Stalin and Nadia.
She sat right opposite him at the table. A lot of drinking, a lot of dancing, Georgian wine. And Stalin started flirting with an actress at the other end of the table. This outraged Nadia, the young wife who was sitting right opposite him, being totally ignored. Then they had this row. She stood up and she shouted at him, "Shut up, shut up, shut up," in front of everybody, and she ran out of the room.
Nadia made her way back to their apartment on her own.
She went up to her room, she wrote a letter that attacked Stalin politically and personally.
What happened next will never be known for sure, but a shot was fired.
At dawn the next morning, the housekeeper burst in, found her mistress dead on the floor with a bullet hole in the heart.
The opposition immediately said that, well, that he killed her. That's the story to this day. But the family know that she did it by her own hand.
The official statement said she had died of acute appendicitis.
When he saw her lying in her coffin, he pushed her away and said, "She went as an enemy." And now, on the basis of my experience of life, I think he realized she'd seen through him. but he wasn't the way he wanted to appear.
Stalin's youngest two children, Svetlana and Vasily, were left without their mother. Brought up in the Kremlin, Vasily felt the heavy pressure from his father.
Vasily was constantly afraid of father. He was afraid of him as a child, and when he was already General Lieutenant of the Air Force, dripping with medals, he was so afraid of father that he literally shook in his boots.
Vasily was made the youngest general in the armed forces. Hated and feared by his comrades, only one thing protected him from being thrown out. He was his father's son.
Once, when we were sitting together, he'd had a skinful, bought himself another one, and I said to him, "Vasya, that's enough, stop." Then he drew his pistol, which he always carried with him, and he said, "I have only two ways out. The pistol is one, and the bottle is the other. Because I only survive as long as father is alive."
But the Soviet people didn't know what Stalin's family knew. They only knew the myth. Stalin was the toast of the empire.
The first toast in our house was always to Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich. Well, that was at a time when in schools songs were sung about him and poems about him recited.
Если ты песни о счастье поешь, если по трудной дороге идешь, знай, ты идешь не один, а вдвоем. Имя заветное в сердце твоем.
Throughout the 1930s, under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union was transformed economically.
He was able to turn the Soviet Union in a very short period of time into a much more modern state, capable by the late 1930s and 1940s of developing sophisticated rocket technology, capable by the late 1940s of producing an atomic bomb. This is in no sense a primitive state.
And the message that Stalin wanted to be heard was clear. One man was responsible for all this progress. Stalin, the supreme father of the Soviet Union. A new city, Stalingrad, was built in his honor.
Around this time, for us, I mean my circle of friends, my colleagues, Stalin appears to be an ingenious statesman who does everything right, who turns the country around from nothing to a superpower.
Мы, женщины, помним и знаем, что нашей новой, счастливой жизни мы обязаны партии большевиков, партии Ленина, Сталина и героев, тому, кто ведет нас от победы к победам, тому, кто завоевал нашу бесконечную любовь и преданность великому родному Сталину.
We believed we were constructing a new world, a new mankind.
But millions paid the price for this economic miracle. Hundreds of thousands slaughtered, hundreds of thousands sent to the Gulag. But thanks to the relentless propaganda machine, his public image remained glorious.
Stalin always regarded the cinema as the most important modern propaganda tool of all. And he took cinema incredibly seriously. He personally supervised it. He personally censored every film. No film could be shown in the Soviet Union without Stalin having worked on the script, talked to the director, chatted to the scriptwriter, often suggested the name of the film, rewritten parts of it, and then passed it for showing.
In fact, the real Stalin was never seen by the ordinary Soviet people. Only a few had the opportunity to see him close up.
And then I see a group of people approaching, and amongst them was a man of very small stature. I look at him and wonder, who could that be? After a while, I realized that it was Stalin. He had a pockmarked face, and his shoulders were very narrow. On the portraits, he was always depicted as being so broad-shouldered, so majestic.
No image left the artist's studio without approval from Stalin. The camera crews were always conscious of how best to present their leader.
He had a double chin, and he knew it. And when we filmed him, he always tried to hold his chin straight, and he looked like this. See? Like this. But when he forgot to do it and let go, then you could see his double chin, and we had to cut out those sequences.
This is the image of Stalin that history is most familiar with, but it isn't Stalin. It is in fact the actor Mikhail Gelovany, who was allowed to play only one part in his film career, that of Stalin.
He played Stalin so incredibly authentically that once Stalin, on being shown a fragment from the film, claimed it was he.
What mattered was that he looked so important on the screen. He wanted everyone to see him and recognize him as a god, a leader. That was typical of him.
Stalin loved film, but his own taste was for light comedy. His clear favorite was the musical Volga Volga.
He often watched this film. When he was tired, had come from meetings, he'd say, "Let's watch Volga Volga."
Stalin sent the film as a gift to the American president. A puzzled White House wondered whether the film contained a secret message. But the director, Alexandrov, had only one instruction: to praise the wonderful life of the Soviet citizens.
Stalin, надо сказать, любил как актрису Орлову.
Stalin, I must say, loved Orlova as an actress. Once he said to director Alexandrov at one of the receptions, "Take care of Orlova. If you don't take care of Orlova, we'll shoot you." This was, of course, intended as a joke, but the kind of joke that can put the fear of death into you.
Это была шутка, конечно. Шутка такая довольно, от которой можно и передернуться.
Crossing Stalin was, of course, no laughing matter. The daily freight trains that carried the deported rolled into the Gulag, the prison camps from which so few returned. But the Stalin myth penetrated even as far as here.
I can remember. It was on the transport. One of the others started singing, "I know no other land on earth where your heart beats so freely." That was, of course, well, what should I say, a bit laughable.
28 million were sent to the Gulag. 3 million never returned.
That was a really popular song. Everyone sang it. We, too, sang it. We got really worked up when we sang it. That was our life, our hope.
Disaster struck on the 22nd of June 1941. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The German advance seemed unstoppable, and within 3 months, Hitler's armies were less than 50 miles from Moscow. It was a week to the anniversary of the revolution, the most important date on the Soviet calendar. Stalin wanted the annual parade in Red Square to go ahead as normal. His generals argued it was far too dangerous. the Soviet army could be obliterated by the Germans.
His top people at the Politburo actually laughed. Molotov and the others said, you're joking, of course. Moscow was actually under fire, artillery fire, as well as aircraft attack. Stalin said, no, I'm not joking. This will be such a secret that you, and he appointed the general who was going to command this huge secret parade. He said, you won't even tell me the time of the parade until the parade actually is about to start. See, I don't even want to know, he said. And they realized he was serious.
A week later, the parade happened as planned. It was an extraordinary achievement.
This was a classic example of Stalin's management of the cult of presentation. And this speech had an enormous power on the Soviet people. But it just shows both his grasp for presentation, but also his nerve, nerves of steel to risk this.
And it worked. The Soviet people at war with Germany heard what they needed to hear.
And then the radio operator comes out of the bunker and says, "Stalin's speaking." And we ran into the shelter, and it wasn't very clear, but it was his voice. He was speaking from Moscow.
Stalin appealed to Russian patriotism, to the spirit of Alexander Nevsky, to the great victories of the Tsarist era.
In those hours, I really felt very close to him.
In mid-November 1941, Stalin's troops forced a reversal in the war, and the German assault on Moscow was beaten off. In the following years, Stalin was rarely seen, preferring his Kontsevor dacha to the Kremlin. There was no news footage of Stalin to feed to the people. They didn't need it. They had the myth. But behind closed doors, Stalin's paranoia was escalating. It would eventually destroy him. June 1945, and the war is over. It's been almost 3 years since Stalin has been seen in public, but now he could style himself as a general and a victor.
By the end of the war, he believed he was a military genius par excellence, that everything he'd done was the sign of absolute martial genius, despite the huge bungles he'd made early in the war.
When the war was finally over, when it had ended with victory, Stalin, of course, became a god, a hero, someone for whom people were prepared to go into battle, in the assault on Berlin, on Königsberg, to Europe, liberating cities. That was an unforgettable time.
In this film, directed by Mikhail Chiarelli, the victorious Stalin flew to Berlin to celebrate its liberation. But it was an event, in reality, that never took place. The Politburo gathered round for a preview of the film.
The film was running. My father was sitting at the back. Of course, everybody had their eyes glued to the screen, but my father was watching Stalin and observing his reactions, because for him, it was a matter of life or death. In the episode where Stalin emerges from the big plane and the whole of Berlin kneels down before him, my father saw that Stalin slowly raised his hand and wiped tears from his eyes. Only then could he breathe freely and said to himself, "I'm saved." Stalin really did like the film. After the showing, he said to my father, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Bravo, lad, bravo." And then he said regretfully, "If only I had done it and had really gone to Berlin."
It was another man, a military general who was actually there to celebrate the victory in Berlin, Marshal Zhukov. It wouldn't be long before he fell into disfavor with Stalin. Stalin's stage was at the Potsdam Conference, with the victorious Allies dividing the spoils of war. Now Stalin was at the zenith of his international career. But his paranoia was also at its peak. The entire railway track was sealed off for his journey back to Moscow. He planned every last detail. No one was going to topple him. During the war years, Stalin kept out of the limelight. He lived almost permanently at his Kuntzervo dacha. Even his children, Svetlana and Vasily, saw little of him, their own lives increasingly cursed by their blood ties to the ruthless dictator. Vasily had always had a hot temper and lived on the edge. The bottle was his constant companion.
Well, he drank. It's bitter to speak about it. It was his ruin. I can remember once, when there was a parade at the Air Force, Stalin arrived a bit late. Vasily Stalin commanded the parade. I'm not saying he was drunk, but he had certainly had a sip of cognac. He reeked of the bottle. That just made things worse, of course.
But Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, had always been his favorite. She was the only person he ever allowed to get close to him. He called her his keeper.
I was his favorite, but also because I was good at school. Until I was 16, I didn't cause him any trouble at all, and he was very satisfied.
But when she grew up, she started causing nothing but trouble. She didn't listen to him. She got divorced, and he never saw some of his grandchildren.
Stalin, so the propaganda went, dedicated himself entirely to his people. A popular rhyme was, "In the Kremlin there burns a light. Comrade Stalin works through the night." But in fact, it was only in the movies that Stalin, portrayed by his double, was omnipresent, modestly receiving his jubilant people.
Спасибо вам, Варвара Михайловна. Спасибо. От имени Родины.
By this time, the real Stalin was at his dacha, fearful of his people, his colleagues, and his staff.
He was distrustful his whole life long, and the longer he was in power, the more power he had, the more distrustful he became. He thought they wanted to take away his power.
Stalin believed himself to be surrounded by enemies, trusting no one and trusted by no one. Most of all, the old man feared the doctors who treated him.
Он заболел гриппом. Вызвали врача с Кремлевской больницы, как обычно. Он обследовал.
He had the flu. The doctor is called from the Kremlin clinic as usual. He duly examines him, prescribes medicine, which he has with him, and leaves there. Then Stalin calls one of the staff whom he knows and sends him to a chemist outside Moscow to buy the same medicine. The one the doctor has left, he just throws away.
Он выполняет все, привозит ему. Лекарство врача он выкидывает.
As the real Stalin retreated, the invincible mythological Stalin was all that was left.
No one could quite treat him as a human being anymore. But of course this made him a very lonely, bitter old man. He used to say, in fact, "Look at me, I'm the most powerful man in the world, and I can't even find anyone to take a cup of tea with."
When in March 1953, Stalin lay dying in his bed, it took over 12 hours for his staff to dare call the doctors.
They're amazed and terrified. The gap between the titan they've seen promoted in film and media, and this old fat man paralyzed down one side, soaked in urine, fighting for breath, is so vast that they actually are incapable of treating him.
Stalin's funeral was his last grand show, but it was nothing more than a facade. His son Vasily was drunk, and soon he would be thrown out of the army and sit out the rest of his life in jail. Svetlana, Stalin's favorite, left the country her father had ruled as a refugee. Beria, Stalin's chief of police, only lived for 3 months after Stalin's death. He was executed on the orders of this man, Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor. Only 3 years later, he would denounce Stalin as a criminal and had his body removed from the Lenin mausoleum at the dead of night. Stalin took at least 20 million people with him to the grave. Only a few were aware of what was really happening.
He was the devil incarnate. The devil incarnate.
And after Stalin died, history was rewritten again. The films that helped build the Stalin cult were remade, literally blocking him out of the history of the revolution where he had put himself in. Erasing the myth, drawing an end to the monumental cult of the tyrant.
Stalin's story continues next Saturday at 8:10, and check out our guide to the Man of Steel at channel4.com/history. Coming up, Morgan Freeman and Tim Robbins both put in the performances of a lifetime. It's got to be in everyone's top 10. The brilliant Shawshank Redemption is next.